I can't even begin to describe what it felt like to walk through the gates of the stadium. It wasn't just any stadium. It was the stadium, and it was the Super Bowl. A lifelong dream was unfolding before me. The air buzzed with electricity, charged by the shouts of fans decked out in jerseys representing teams from all corners of the country. It didn't matter if your team was playing today. If you were here, you were part of something bigger. The sidewalks outside were chaos in the best way. Scalpers yelling about last-minute tickets. Vendors hawking beer and foam fingers. A guy dressed as a giant football was taking pictures with kids while parents juggled their overpriced pretzels and nacho trays. It was everything I'd ever imagined and more. As I scanned my ticket and entered the gates, I took a moment to soak it all in. The aroma of grilled onions and sausage wafted through the air, blending with the faint chemical scent of freshly cleaned concrete. Everything felt surreal. My seat wasn't anything special. Upper level, nosebleed territory, but I didn't care. I was here, walking up the steep incline to my section. I joined a swarm of people funneling into the rows of hard plastic seats. Strangers exchanged predictions about the game, and everyone seemed to have a unique ritual for good luck. Some fans were draped in elaborate costumes, while others wore war paint in their team's colors. I couldn't stop grinning. The first glimpse of the field made my breath catch. It was more beautiful than I'd ever imagined. Perfectly manicured grass, the brilliant shine of the lights bouncing off every surface. The players were already warming up, dots of color moving methodically as they practiced plays. I found my seat, carefully balancing my hot dog and beer as I sat down, making sure to avoid knocking knees with the guy next to me. He gave me a nod, and we exchanged the kind of smile that said, "We're in this together." The first quarter was everything I'd hoped it would be. The energy of the crowd rose and fell like waves, crashing together during touchdowns and turnovers. I found myself completely absorbed in the rhythm of the game. The fans around me were a patchwork of emotions: joy, frustration, relief. Every play felt monumental. But then, during the second quarter, something began to gnaw at the edges of my excitement. It started with the man sitting a few rows ahead of me. He didn't seem like your average fan. For starters, he wasn't watching the game. While the rest of us cheered, groaned, or shouted at the refs, he stayed hunched over, constantly glancing at his phone. His knee bounced in an erratic rhythm, and his head darted left and right as though he was scanning the crowd. At first, I tried to ignore him. Maybe he was just some guy who got dragged here by a football-crazed friend or spouse. But the more I watched, the more his behavior unsettled me. He wasn't just nervous, he was watching. I caught him scanning entire sections, his eyes narrowing every time he paused on someone for longer than a second. It felt like he was searching for something, or someone. I shook it off. Paranoia was an easy trap to fall into in a crowd this size. But when halftime arrived, the man bolted from his seat so quickly he almost tripped over the row in front of him. It was odd enough that I felt compelled to follow. My curiosity got the better of me. I slipped into the packed concourse, scanning the crowd for any sign of him. The crush of bodies made it nearly impossible to track anyone. People swarmed around concession stands, laughing and shouting over each other. A marching band performed nearby, their brass instruments gleaming under the harsh stadium lights. Then I spotted him, his distinctive blue hoodie weaving through the crowd like a needle through fabric. He moved with purpose, dodging clusters of fans, as though he had somewhere urgent to be. I quickened my pace, trying to keep him in sight without being obvious. But just as quickly as I'd found him, he was gone. I turned in a circle, scanning the concourse, but it was no use. He'd vanished into the sea of fans. Frustrated, I made my way back to my seat, telling myself I'd let my imagination run wild. The second half started, and I forced myself to focus on the game. The action on the field was intense, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept glancing toward the man's empty seat. He hadn't returned. And then it happened. Midway through the third quarter, the stadium's massive jumbotron flickered. The usual graphics, team logos, advertisements, vanished, replaced by a black screen. For a split second, text flashed across it in bold, white letters. "Are you watching me?" I blinked, unsure if I'd actually seen it. The message was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a commercial for car insurance. I glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the crowd was as raucous as ever, oblivious to what I thought I'd just witnessed. It was nothing, I told myself, just a glitch. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as the game continued, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong, that someone, somewhere, was watching me. The energy in the stadium was electric as the fourth quarter began. Both teams were neck and neck, trading blows like heavyweight fighters. The crowd roared with every big play, a deafening wall of sound that shook the stands. I tried to lose myself in the game, to forget about the strange man from earlier and the unsettling message on the Jumbotron. But something about the night felt off, like a dark undercurrent running beneath the excitement. Then I saw him, or at least I thought I did, the man in the blue hoodie. He was standing in an aisle on the opposite side of the stadium, partially obscured by a group of fans waving oversized foam fingers. My pulse quickened. He wasn't in his seat from earlier, and he wasn't alone. A second man stood nearby, his body language just as tense and fidgety. The second man was older, with a salt and pepper beard and a bulky jacket that looked out of place for the mild weather. He and the man in the hoodie seemed to exchange a brief glance, followed by a subtle nod. Then the older man lifted his phone, tilting it toward the crowd as if he were filming. My stomach churned. It wasn't unusual for fans to record parts of the game, but something about his movements felt calculated. He wasn't aiming his camera at the field or the players. His lens was fixed on the crowd, on us. I leaned forward, squinting to make sense of it. Was he documenting the atmosphere, or was it something else? Something more sinister? I scanned the faces of the fans around me, wondering if anyone else noticed. They were too engrossed in the action to pay attention to a couple of men lurking in the shadows. I thought about telling someone security, maybe, but what would I even say? That I'd seen two strangers acting suspiciously in a stadium packed with tens of thousands of people that hardly seemed like a smoking gun. The minutes ticked by, and the tension on the field mirrored my own. With every big play, my eyes darted between the game and the two men. The man in the hoodie whispered something to the older man before slipping away into the crowd. I followed his movements as best I could, watching as he weaved through the aisles. He stopped occasionally, glancing around as if looking for something or someone. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was looking for, it had nothing to do with football. The next few plays were crucial, and the crowd roared in unison as a touchdown tied the game. The noise was so loud, I barely heard the commotion at first. A section to my left erupted in chaos, fans shouting and shoving as a fight broke out. Plastic beer cups flew through the air, and someone's nachos hit the floor in an explosion of chips and cheese. For a moment, I thought it was just drunk fans getting out of hand. But as I turned my attention to the skirmish, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. The older man was there, lingering at the edge of the chaos, his phone still pointed toward the crowd. He didn't look panicked or concerned. He looked like he was waiting for something, watching. My eyes darted back to the man in the hoodie, who had reappeared a few rows down. He wasn't watching the fight either. Instead, he seemed to be scanning the stadium, his head swiveling back and forth like a hawk searching for prey. The fight escalated quickly, drawing the attention of security guards who rushed to break it up. Fans shouted insults, and a handful of people tried to record the chaos on their phones. In the confusion, I noticed both men slip away, their movements almost synchronized. It was like they had rehearsed it. I sat frozen, torn between my growing unease and the realization that I might be overreacting. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe the fight was just a fight, and the two men had nothing to do with it. But the thought wouldn't stick. Deep down, I knew there was more to it. The game pressed on, the stadium a pressure cooker of energy and anticipation. The players were locked in a tense battle, and every fan was on their feet, shouting themselves hoarse. I tried to focus, to let the rhythm of the game pull me back into the moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man in the hoodie standing behind me. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. My stomach churned with unease, the thrill of the Super Bowl tainted by a creeping sense of dread. As the clock wound down, the stadium erupted in celebration. A field goal sealed the victory for the home team, and fans roared as confetti rained down. The energy was infectious, but I couldn't bring myself to join in. I stood there clutching my phone, scanning the crowd one last time. The two men were nowhere to be seen. My phone buzzed in my hand, the vibration startling me. I looked down at the screen, expecting a text from a friend or a notification from social media. Instead, it was an anonymous message. "We've been watching you all along." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who was watching me? And why? I looked up, scanning the crowd again. But the faces around me were blurred by the confetti and the chaos of celebration. I was surrounded by thousands of people, yet I'd never felt more alone. By the time I got back to my hotel, I was exhausted in every way a person could be. My legs ached from climbing stairs and weaving through crowds. My throat was raw from yelling at the game, and my mind was spinning like a hamster on a wheel. I dropped my jacket on the bed and slumped into the nearest chair, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Maybe it was just the adrenaline. Big events like the Super Bowl can make people hyper-aware, overly analytical. My brain was probably just piecing together coincidences, weaving them into a story that didn't exist. The man in the hoodie, the message on the Jumbotron, the anonymous text. Maybe it was all a prank, some elaborate stunt to mess with fans. But as much as I tried to convince myself, the knot of unease in my stomach refused to loosen. Something about it all felt too deliberate, too targeted. And then there was the text. "We've been watching you all along." It wasn't just creepy, it was specific. Someone wanted me to know I wasn't imagining things. I stood and grabbed my jacket, intending to throw it over the back of the chair, when I noticed something odd. A small sticker was stuck to the fabric, just below the collar. I didn't remember seeing it before, and I definitely hadn't put it there. I plucked the sticker off and held it up to the light. It was no bigger than a postage stamp, with a QR code printed in black against a white background. Beneath the code, a single word was printed in bold letters: tracked. The knot in my stomach tightened into a fist. My pulse quickened as I turned the sticker over in my hands, searching for an explanation. Who had put this on me? How long had it been there? I thought back to the game, to the crowded concourse and the jostling fans. Someone could have easily slapped it on my jacket without me noticing. My first instinct was to throw it away, to pretend I'd never seen it. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out an old burner phone I kept for emergencies, something unconnected to my personal accounts or phone number. If this was some kind of scam, I didn't want them accessing my data. Holding my breath, I opened the camera app and scanned the code. The phone buzzed, and a video feed loaded almost instantly. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The screen showed a bird's-eye view of a crowded stadium section. Fans were on their feet, cheering, waving their arms. It took me a second to realize I was looking at the game from earlier that day. My stomach dropped as the camera panned across the crowd and settled on a single figure, me. There I was, sitting in my seat, oblivious to the fact that someone had been watching me the entire time. The feed wasn't just a recording, it was a live broadcast of surveillance footage. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. This wasn't a prank. Someone had gone to great lengths to track me, to make sure I knew I was being tracked. My head swam with questions. Who were they? Why me? What did they want? A loud knock at the door snapped me out of my spiral. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and deliberate. I froze, my mind racing. Who would be visiting me this late? I crept to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Peering through the peephole, I saw a familiar face, the man in the blue hoodie. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, his shoulders hunched and his hands jammed into his pockets. He wasn't looking directly at the door. Instead, he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he were afraid someone might be watching. My first instinct was to lock the deadbolt and pretend I wasn't there. But before I could decide what to do, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it under the door and walked away without a word. I waited until I was sure he was gone before opening the door a crack and retrieving the note. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The paper was creased and slightly damp, the ink smudged but still legible. The note read, "Don't tell anyone, or they'll know we've both seen too much." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. We've both seen too much? What had I seen? The surveillance? The fight? The cryptic message on the Jumbotron? I didn't even know what I was looking for, let alone what I was supposed to have stumbled upon. I sat on the edge of the bed, the note clutched in my hand, and replayed the day in my mind. Every strange interaction, every detail I might have missed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I didn't know. Who was the man in the blue hoodie? What was his connection to the older man? And why had he gone out of his way to warn me? I glanced at the sticker on the nightstand, the word "tracked" staring back at me like an accusation. If the man in the hoodie was right, if we really had seen something we weren't supposed to, then throwing the sticker away wouldn't make a difference. They already knew where I was. For the first time since the game, I felt truly afraid. I wasn't just a fan caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was a target, and I had no idea how far they'd go to keep their secrets. I couldn't sleep. I lay on the stiff hotel bed, replaying the events of the day over and over until I couldn't tell what was real and what was paranoia. The sticker, the QR code, the surveillance feed, it all pointed to something far bigger than me. And then there was the note from the man in the hoodie. "Don't tell anyone, or they'll know we've both seen too much." Too much of what? What could possibly warrant this level of secrecy? By morning, I'd made up my mind. If I was being watched, if I was a target, then I had to know why. Ignorance wasn't safety. It was a blindfold. I returned to the stadium under the pretense of retrieving a forgotten item. Security was reluctant to let me in at first, but a convincing story about a lost wallet got me past the gates. The air was eerily still compared to the chaos of the previous day. Workers were cleaning up confetti, stacking chairs, and dismantling stages. The magic of the Super Bowl had evaporated, leaving behind only the bones of the event. I retraced my steps to section 347, where I'd sat during the game. The sticker that had been on my jacket burned in my pocket as I scanned the rows of seats. It wasn't long before I spotted another one, identical to mine, stuck beneath the armrest of a chair 2 rows down. Tracked, it read with the same QR code. I peeled it off and kept searching. There was another one a few seats over, and another near the aisle. Some were partially hidden under the seats, others attached to the back of stadium benches. My chest tightened as the pattern became clear. Whoever had placed these stickers wasn't targeting individuals at random. They were systematically marking entire sections of the stadium. I needed answers, and the only person who might have them was the man in the hoodie. Finding him wasn't going to be easy, but I had one lead: the note he'd left under my door. The paper was cheap and damp, the ink slightly smudged. But in the corner, there was a faint logo from a local diner. A quick search led me to a rundown 24-hour spot about a mile from the stadium. The kind of place where the coffee tastes like burnt plastic and the vinyl booze stick to your skin. It was nearly empty when I walked in. A waitress glanced at me over her shoulder, but didn't bother to offer a greeting. And there he was, sitting in a back booth with his hood up, staring into a half-empty cup of coffee. He didn't flinch when I slid into the seat across from him. Up close, he looked even more worn down than I'd imagined. Dark circles clung to his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup to his lips. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I placed a sticker on the table between us. "What's going on?" I demanded. "What is this? Why are people being tracked?" He glanced at the sticker, but didn't reach for it. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, almost to himself. Then he sighed and leaned back in the booth. "All right, I'll tell you, but you need to understand. Once you know, there's no going back." I nodded, my heart pounding. "My name's Eric," he began. "I used to work for a private security firm. We were hired by the Super Bowl organizers to handle crowd management and safety. But our job wasn't just about catching pickpockets or stopping fights. We were testing something new, something experimental." He gestured toward the sticker. "That's part of it. They call it targeted behavioral recognition. It's a surveillance system that uses AI to monitor people in real time. Every seat, every aisle, every corner of that stadium is covered by cameras and sensors. The system flags anyone who exhibits suspicious behavior." I frowned. Suspicious how? Eric's lips twisted into a bitter smile. That's the thing. It doesn't really know. It looks at stuff like where you're sitting, how often you check your phone, even the way you move. But the algorithm isn't perfect. Sometimes it flags actual threats. Other times it flags people like you. I felt a chill run down my spine. But why me? What did I do? I don't know, Eric admitted. Maybe you looked nervous. Maybe you stood out in the wrong way. Or maybe they just needed test subjects. That's what this is, really a massive experiment disguised as security. The more Eric talked, the more surreal it all felt. He described a system designed to predict and prevent crimes before they happened. On paper, it sounded like a technological marvel. In practice, it was a nightmare. Innocent people were being tracked, analyzed, and labeled as threats based on arbitrary data points. They're not just watching you, Eric said. They're building a profile. Your habits, your patterns, your connections. It's all being logged. Why are you telling me this? I asked. If it's so dangerous, why not keep your head down? Because I helped build it, Eric said quietly. And now I can't live with myself. Before I could ask more, Eric's eyes darted to the window. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. We're being watched, he muttered. I turned to look, but he grabbed my arm. Don't. Just listen. You need to leave. Forget about this. What? I asked, incredulous. You just said. I said too much, he interrupted. They're already onto us. If you keep digging, they'll come after you too. He slid out of the booth, leaving a few crumpled bills on the table. Stay out of sight, he said. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone. Before I could respond, he was gone. The hotel room was no longer safe. That much was clear when I returned after meeting Eric to find the door ajar and the contents of my suitcase scattered across the floor. Someone had been here, and they hadn't been subtle about it. My laptop sat open on the desk, its screen cracked, files erased. Even my burner phone, the one I'd used to scan the sticker, was missing. Panic clawed at my chest as I checked my bank account on my primary phone. The balance read 0. My credit cards were frozen too, with transactions I hadn't authorized showing up in places I'd never been. Someone was systematically erasing me. They wanted me to back off, to disappear quietly. But I was past the point of running. If Eric was right, and they were experimenting on thousands of innocent people, someone had to expose it. I didn't care what it took. I spent the next day retracing my steps, trying to piece together the fragments of evidence I had left. Every call I made dropped after a single ring. Emails to journalists bounced back as undeliverable. The message was clear. They were watching me, and they weren't going to let this story get out. But there was one piece of evidence they hadn't taken, because they didn't know I'd seen it. During my first visit back to the stadium, I'd spotted a camera hidden near one of the marked seats. It wasn't like the regular surveillance cameras mounted high on the walls. This one was small, discreet, nestled under the seat bracket, as if it were never meant to be found. If I could retrieve that camera, it might hold the proof I needed to blow this whole operation open. It was risky, suicidal, even, but it was the only chance I had. The stadium loomed like a monolith against the night sky, its towering lights extinguished. Security was tighter than it had been during the game, with guards patrolling the perimeter. I kept to the shadows, circling to a service entrance I'd scoped out earlier. The door was locked, but a loose panel in the fencing provided just enough space to slip through. The inside of the stadium was eerie in its emptiness. The stands that had been packed with roaring fans were now silent, the echo of my footsteps swallowed by the cavernous space. I made my way to section 347, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Every creak of metal and shuffle of fabric sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. There it was, the hidden camera, right where I remembered it. My fingers trembled as I unscrewed it from its mount, carefully tucking it into the pocket of my jacket. The relief was fleeting. Just as I turned to leave, the floodlights roared to life, bathing the stadium in harsh, blinding light. A voice boomed over the intercom, cold and mocking. You really should have just enjoyed the game. My stomach dropped as figures emerged from the shadows, their movements precise and deliberate. They wore dark security uniforms, their faces obscured by helmets. They didn't speak as they surrounded me. closing in like a tightening noose. I clutched the camera in my pocket, my mind racing. There was no way out. They had me cornered. Two of the men grabbed my arms, wrenching them behind my back with enough force to make me cry out. "You've been causing us a lot of trouble," one of them said, his voice flat and emotionless. "But it ends here." I braced myself for whatever was coming next. A black bag over my head, a one-way trip to some undisclosed location. But before they could act, a deafening explosion rocked the stadium. The ground beneath my feet trembled as a plume of smoke rose from a distant section, the sound reverberating like thunder. The guards hesitated, their grips loosening as they turned toward the source of the chaos. That was all the opening I needed. Eric appeared out of nowhere, his face streaked with soot and his eyes wild. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the nearest exit. We sprinted through the maze of aisles and tunnels, the smoke and confusion buying us precious seconds. Behind us, the guards barked orders, their footsteps pounding like a drumbeat. "Where are we going?" I gasped. "There's a service hatch near the east gate," Eric replied. "It leads to the maintenance tunnels. We can lose them there." We reached the hatch just as the guards closed in. Eric yanked it open and shoved me inside. "Go," he said. "I'll hold them off." "What about you?" I asked, but he was already turning back, his face set with grim determination. "Just go," he shouted. "Get the truth out." I didn't stop running until I was miles away, the cold night air burning my lungs. I collapsed in an alley, clutching the camera like a lifeline. My hands shook as I replayed the footage it contained, a mix of grainy surveillance clips and audio recordings. It was damning, a detailed record of the operation, complete with notes on how test subjects were flagged and monitored. The next morning, I uploaded everything to a journalist I trusted, someone I knew wouldn't be intimidated by threats or bribes. Within hours, the story was live, a blistering expose that sent shockwaves through the media. But Eric was gone. He didn't answer my messages, and the diner where we'd met was boarded up. The only sign of him came in the form of a handwritten note slipped under my hotel door. "They'll deny everything, but at least now you're free." For now. I returned home a week later, but the sense of safety I once took for granted was gone. Every camera, every shadow, every stranger on the street felt like a threat. The story had gone viral, but the powers behind the surveillance operation denied everything. It didn't matter. The truth was out there, and I had done my part. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.